What I've always most appreciated about Council President Gonzalez is the strength of her vision for a more just city. In particular, she's been just a fantastic partner to me.
Council President, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I have always had tremendous respect for you. And as Councilmember Strauss said, you have definitely changed this city and you have definitely changed this council, and your leadership is certainly appreciated.
Well, the voices you're hearing right there, Councilmember Lisa Herbold, Councilmember Deborah Juarez, their reactions to the departure of Council President Lorena Gonzalez, and now Herbold or Juarez are both trying to be your next Seattle City Council president. Now, this is a title that in the past was largely ceremonial and not even one that council members were all that eager to take. So why is our new mayor weighing in on this decision? And also, why is our outgoing mayor leaving with another parting shot from the city council following her? Well, guess what? We're going to follow these topics and a whole lot more here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, ladies and gentlemen, new co-host in the new year, it's David Croman from the Seattle Times. David, thank you so much for joining me here. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to introduce you to people if I could. You've had a pretty good career here in Seattle covering local politics and whatever else is going on. Talk to us a little bit about your journalist background.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the area and kind of fell into journalism a few years ago in around 2014 when I started writing some for Crosscut, and then a job opened up and they hired me. And so for about 7 years, I was writing mostly about local politics and, social issues in Seattle and King County. People sort of called me a City Hall reporter, but I think that my beat was probably a little broader than that. But recently I started a new job covering transportation with the Seattle Times. So that is going to be my focus for the foreseeable future. But, I'm still interested and happy to be paying attention to City Hall and local politics and that sort of thing, because I don't want to get too far from that.
No. And it's all connected to these issues of transportation. I know that. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about David's transportation reporting later on in the show. So stick around for that. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. They're still on the first floor of City Hall, so please do support them and other small businesses out there. Thanks also to our patrons. I'm hoping more of you can join in at the $10 level and earn yourself a Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. David, I got to send you one of these. It'll happen soon, I promise. Our mug shot of the week comes in from John with a mug full of snow. Great photo there. Thank you for sending that in. And please do be safe out there, folks, as we continue to deal with this cold, snowy weather here in the Seattle area. Finally, thanks to Converge Media, the video version of our podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. Here we go with Right Here, Right Now. So one of the first things the Seattle City Council does in the new year is select a council president. And that is the big item on the agenda here in the first week of January. So Councilmember Swant is the most senior member of the council, just survived that recall attempt there. Just behind her in seniority, Councilmembers Juarez and Herbold both are trying to get this position, this council president position behind the scenes. And David, as I mentioned before, this really isn't a role that council members have wanted in the past. It limits a council member's ability, I would say, to create legislation, to do what you're elected to do when you have to be in charge of signing checks for council staff and other duties like that. But now this job really has seemed to turn into a bit of a political football. Mayor-elect Harrell is weighing in, saying he wants Deborah Juarez. The Times editorial staff has urged the council to pick Juarez too. What do you think is going on here?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I think you're right that if you actually look at the duties of this job, a lot of it is administrative. You become sort of the boss of the legislative branch of Seattle City Hall. It does come with some political power. I mean, you can shape committee appointments, so that is big. And then, I think you are in some ways, how like the Senate Majority Leader or Speaker of the House can kind of be the funnel of legislation and can kind of dictate where certain legislation is going. That is not an insignificant role, especially nowadays when there seems to be so much overlap in how the committees are defined in Seattle City Hall. I mean, it used to be very clear. It was like, this was the housing one, this was the transportation one. But lately they've gotten to be, have like 4 different priority, duties in each committee, which means that sometimes it's not always clear where certain legislation goes, and
Right.
occasionally there are fights over that.
Hmm.
You know, and it matters if a piece of legislation starts in, say, Councilmember Sawant's committee versus
Sure.
Councilmember Peterson's committee. That does
Hmm.
make a difference, and so
Yeah.
who the council president is will matter from that perspective.
Yeah.
That said, I think whoever the council president is, it's not like this is going to fundamentally alter the next 4 years.
Right.
I think what might be happening is, it's a title. On the campaign trail,
Hmm.
we didn't call Lorena Gonzalez Council Member
That's
Gonzalez. We
right.
called her
That's
Council
right.
President
Yeah.
Gonzalez,
And
and that
Council
makes
President
a difference.
Harrell was before her. I mean, that's a really interesting part. And I remember when he was in City Hall, not all that long ago, insisted on that title. Council President Harrell did when he served in that role. So I think there is a little bit of I don't know. It does appear to be more and more of an important title for these people who take it.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know how much of a big factor this is, but you do get paid more to be
Okay.
the
All
council
right.
president.
All
So it's
right.
not,
There you go.
there is some financial benefit to, but
Got
I
it.
think at the end of the day, um, it's mostly a title thing.
Yeah.
From my conversations past with council members, a good council president is the council president who gets out of their way and basically lets
Right.
them do what they want.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, um, but I also, I guess there's some symbolism to it. I mean, if Lisa Herbold is the council president versus
Right.
Deborah Juarez, I mean, that
Yeah.
kind of sends some kind of signal of what sort of council this is,
Sure.
because they have different politics.
Sure, sure. But just to jump in here, David, to your point there, I don't think this is a fundamental change. Even if Lisa Herbold were named the council president here, I think we're still looking at this block of more moderate candidates. And I would have to say Sarah Nelson joins that block of moderate candidates with Nelson, with Juarez, with Peterson there. You still got this group of 6 more progressive candidates. And I'm talking about Herbold there, of course. I'm talking about Morales going around the horn here, Sawant, Strauss, Lewis, Mosqueda. I mean, I don't think there's a huge fundamental change there when it comes to how Seattle politics are going to look from a city council perspective going forward.
No, I would agree with that. And I mean, they used to solve this problem by just giving it to the kind of most senior person, and there
Right,
wasn't a lot
right.
of like
That's
politicking
Councilmember
around it.
Sawant, so watch out on that one. Yeah, okay.
Right, which they
Yeah,
won't do. They won't do
yeah.
that. So that's part of what complicates it is,
Hmm.
because Council President Sawant or Council Member Sawant is the most senior. The rest of the council, even the most progressive members, I don't think are interested in making her council president, and she might not be
Right.
interested in it either, because
True.
it is an administrative job that will eat up more of her hours.
Right, right, right. And I know, folks, as David mentioned earlier, these committees often get renamed when we talk about governance and education. Maybe Sarah Nelson's going to take on that job. She's coming in as the Position 9 citywide person. Lorena Gonzalez led that. Is Sarah Nelson going to lead that? We'll have to see. But these committees are going to get renamed in this first week here of January. So we'll be trying to keep score as best we can on this. Will Councilmember Lewis continue to be head of the homelessness committee there? Will Councilmember Herbold continue her role in leading public safety? A lot of tempestuous times over the past couple of years when it comes to both those committees and how the council's reacted on that. So we'll definitely be keeping track of that. But just to move the conversation forward here, David, I did want to talk about Mayor Harrell taking office this week. He's going to forego a big public inauguration type of situation, from what I understand here, definitely citing some of the issues with the COVID-19 crisis. And we're going to talk about those rising numbers in just a minute here. But he's got a team that's basically set up, ready to go. I'm very interested to see how Kendi Yamaguchi will be as Deputy Mayor of External Relations. She's the former Snohomish County Executive, former City of Seattle Director of Digital Engagement a few years ago. Also, Davida Briscoe, sister of Shay Taylor, who was shot by Seattle police in 2016. She's the new gun violence prevention liaison. I guess I just wanted to know, David, what are you paying most attention to when it comes to these appointments or just some of the major decisions that Mayor Harrell has to make as he steps into office?
Well, you can kind of read into like priorities.
Hmm.
I think Davida Briscoe is a really important, really interesting
Yeah, I
appointment,
think so too.
um, because she is somebody who, her experience with police violence is undeniable. Her brother was shot and killed by Seattle police, which of course is very controversial. You could spend a whole episode just talking about the circumstances surrounding that. But at the end of the day, it is something she knows very intimately, and yet has spoken out against the idea of defunding the police. So for somebody like Bruce Harrell, who ran as, he's the first Black mayor since Norm Rice. He ran on his bona fides in the community, and basically was making the argument that the community does not want to defund the police, and what the community wants is more reform of the police. And so somebody like Davida Briscoe, who I think brings some credibility to that argument that he was making to the office, and sort of sets out the tone for how he'd like to address policing going forward, which is advocating for, Davida Briscoe has done a lot of advocacy for statewide reforms, state legislative reforms, and things that you could be very clearly classified as reform, none of which defund the police. So I think that's an interesting tone. We also Manisha Harrell's appointment as deputy mayor is an interesting one. I think it's slightly controversial because anytime a mayor is giving jobs to family members, of course that raises nepotism questions. Monisha Harrell is highly qualified, which I think has muted some of that. She has done a lot of work in the city. So no one really doubts that her qualifications, but I do think it says something about Bruce Harrell, which is he's somebody who really values loyalty and really will keep his friends, the people he trusts certain people deeply and is going to keep those people close.
I did want to make sure that I pointed out too that there are a lot of decisions that Mayor Harrell has to make here. I've been talking about on the show about the eviction moratorium that's set to end on January 15th. That's a big one that's kind of right around the corner here. We're also talking about choosing a new police chief. We're talking about trying to create a better relationship with the Seattle City Council, which was pretty poor over the last 4 years with Mayor Durkan. I'm always looking for that first thing, David, like that first thing that Mayor Harrell is going to tackle out there. Some thoughts about that. What's on that big urgent list for him to tackle going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the priorities were already laid out in the campaign. And why did Bruce Harrell get elected? I think the reason Bruce Harrell got elected was because of what he said around homelessness and policing. And so homelessness and policing are going to be issues 1 and 2. What he does in his early days, I think is we'll see. The promises he made on the campaign trail were pretty close to the promises made in that Compassion Seattle initiative,
which did make it on the ballot,
which never went to the ballot. But this notion of scaling up emergency shelter really quickly, while being a little stricter and more proactive about public encampments. That's not going to be an easy thing. It's a highly controversial thing. We've seen that before. And it's a promise that other mayors have made as well that hasn't really played out. And so I think he'll have a very short honeymoon period, very short, probably shorter than most mayors. And before people start expecting him to show real results on homelessness. And then, of course, like you mentioned, he's got to choose a police chief, and that's going to be an enormous decision. Can you find the unicorn out there who is pro reform, understands the new vision of policing in a place like Seattle, who can win the respect of a disgruntled police force in a city. The relationship between the city council and the police in Seattle is horrible. So can you find somebody who wants to do that job and who will be good at that job? It's going to be incredibly hard. And
don't make it sound too easy, David. That's that's a lot going on there. I look at that decision as a huge one there. I look at that eviction moratorium, which I think early indications, as I've talked to the mayor's office, seems like he's going to try to push that down the road a little further just so we can study what's going on there. But I think this is going to be very interesting, too, when it comes to his relationship with the city council, because this is something that's going to move and shift over the next couple years. Because I look ahead just a few years now to 2023, you've got 7 of 9 council members, all those district-based council members. They're going to be up for re-election at that point. So I think this is kind of that period, as you say, a short honeymoon period for the mayor, but also really working to forge those relationships with the city council. He does have that prior experience. He knows all these people on city council right now. So I'm wondering about that piece, though, about how he really tries to reach out to these council members and forge those better connections. Because, as I said earlier, it just was not a solid connection between the city council and Mayor Durkan.
Yeah, and that was also another promise that he made on the campaign trail, was
Right.
that he would not be a divisive mayor. Usually, for some reason, in these fights, the onus tends to land on the city council. The
Right.
city council
It's always their
is more
fault. Yeah.
quickly is more quickly painted as the divisive one rather than the
Hmm.
mayor.
Hmm.
But if you talk to city council members, they would say, well, I know that Councilmember Lewis, for example, was really frustrated that he felt like the executive branch under Mayor Durkan was not moving as quickly on opening up tiny
Yes,
home villages as
that's
he'd
right.
like.
Hmm.
And so I think by the end there, the relationship between the executive branch and the city council was pretty fried,
Hmm.
because from the executive branch's point of view, the city council was making rash decisions around public safety and policing without having proper conversations, while from the council's point of view, they were passing legislation and budgeting things for things that their priorities, and the mayor's office wasn't executing on them. So um, it'll be interesting to see if a restart is possible. I think it's
Hmm.
probably a little more possible because, as you mentioned, the council is now going to be slightly more moderate with the addition of
Yeah.
Sarah
Sarah
Nelson.
Nelson. Yeah.
So the balance tips. No, this is the city council before could pass, if all of the sort of quote more progressive members
Hmm.
coalesced around a priority, they could pass it
Right.
and not fear a veto because they
Right.
had enough
Right.
votes to overturn that.
Hmm.
With Sarah Nelson's addition, it's still a progressive majority.
Right.
I quibble a little bit with this strict binaries of progressive and
Yes.
moderate,
Of course. Of course. Yes.
um, but if the mayor's veto is going to be more powerful now,
Hmm.
because he's going to have three probably 100% reliable allies, and
Yeah.
then a few council members who are a little more up for grabs. But
Yeah.
even with those three allies, suddenly a veto is a little
Carries
more
more power.
powerful, and that will, I think, force both branches to work a little more closely together.
I think so too. And he has also said, Mayor Harrell has said that he won't do the tactic of returning legislation unsigned, which happened a number of times during the Durkan legislation. That legislation does go through and is enacted, but without the mayor's signature is what happens in that dealing there. But the mayor, Mayor Harrell, has said that he's not going to be doing that. So it's going to be very interesting to hear how he approaches that, how that goes forward. So definitely a lot to keep track of there. David, thank you for your insight on that. I wanted to make sure that we followed up on another piece, though. You got one mayor coming in, another leaving. We're talking about the legacy of Jenny Durkan and a fight the city council tried to pick with her during her last week in office. Well, that's coming up on Now Hear This. Well, Seattle's 56th mayor, Jenny Durkan, came into office on a calm but cold day in January of 2018 and departs as we try to chisel our way out of a snowstorm in Seattle and rising concern over the COVID-19 pandemic. Her last press conference on Seattle Channel happened just a few days before Christmas as she urged city residents to be strong in the face of multiple challenges this winter.
It's going to require every one of our residents and businesses helping and doing their part, just like you've done over the last 2 years through just really unprecedented times. And I want to thank you as mayor, the way that this city has stepped up every time we've had not just a severe weather event, but a global pandemic and other challenges. So thank you very much, and everybody have safe holidays. Take care.
Well, David, I wanted to start with a big question here about the legacy that Jenny Durkan leaves behind. Whatever you want to say about it, it was definitely defined by the COVID-19 issues, and many of them there, and also just crisis response in general. Your thoughts about the Durkan legacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's no doubt, and I think without dispute, that she did face more and more serious crises than any mayor.
In recent
Since most of
history,
us,
sure. Yeah.
have probably been alive.
Mhm.
That's true. I mean, you think about Greg Nichols struggling to get out of the primary because he didn't salt Seattle's streets well enough.
Yeah, it's like, really?
During a snowstorm.
Yeah,
And
right.
uh, So the COVID pandemic, the protests. I mean, even the West Seattle Bridge. The West Seattle
Sure.
Bridge, under normal circumstances, would have been kind of a term-defining
Mm-hmm.
emergency, but in this case, it
Sure.
was probably like 4 or 5.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, her legacy will be marked as being a crisis, one of managing
Responding to
during a
crisis. Yeah.
crisis.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I think for some, being there's that quote, like, never waste a good. I think
Mm.
Rahm Emanuel actually said, never waste a
Never.
good crisis.
Right. Right.
And I
Right.
think the question really will be, like, at a sort of existential moment, like,
Mm-hmm.
what direction did she move the city? I think
Mm.
Jenny Durkan sees herself as somebody who basically stopped the city from falling into chaos,
Right. Right.
and that is in and of itself a success.
Yeah.
I think some of her progressive critics say she didn't do enough to kind of fundamentally alter how we do business in Seattle.
Right.
They feel
Right.
like she
Yeah.
didn't do enough around homelessness or police reform. And
Sure.
I think Mayor Durkan is going to look back, and the things that she speaks to most readily is the passing of the Seattle Promise levy, more education funding,
Right. Right.
expansion of
Mm-hmm.
community college, which is obviously a popular thing in Seattle. It passed,
Oh yeah.
passed quite easily, and
Mm-hmm.
that will be true. That will be a legacy item. She, I think since I think Bruce Harrell's election, and I get the sense, at least from talking to her staff,
Yeah.
vindicates for
Mm.
them kind of their approach to the
I
policing
see.
issue.
Yeah.
There was a lot of pressure at the end of the summer in 2020 to kind of
Mm-hmm.
commit to this 50% defunding,
Right. Right.
defund the
Right.
police, and we saw most of the council, at least temporarily, kind of sign on to that.
Right. Right.
And Jenny Durkan resisted that. She said she was
Mm-hmm.
going to make some changes, but
Sure.
resisted ever calling for defunding the police. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that her office views, which is basically what Bruce Harrell did on the campaign trail, and then he
Right.
won easily. And so I think
Yeah.
her office views his election as vindication of the fact that what you see on, say, Twitter or whatever is
Right.
not a reflection of what people
Sure.
in Seattle actually want.
Sure. Sure.
So,
Yeah.
her legacy is going to be mixed. And then, it's undeniable. There's some transparency questions around how she handled her text messages, and
Right.
But for her, in her eyes, it is, at the end of the day, her COVID response is the thing she
Mm-hmm.
wants to be remembered for, because Seattle is highly vaccinated and saw fewer deaths than
Yep.
most other big cities in the country.
Yep.
It's hard to know how much of that was specifically because of her office, or just because
Sure.
of the fact that we live in a city with major medical institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we
Yeah.
have,
They're pushing
I think,
for it.
people's acceptance of vaccines and science is high in Seattle.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I would say, if I had to sum it up, a crisis mayor that who felt like she managed the city as best as she could, considering
Yeah.
the circumstances,
Right.
while her progressive critics felt like she should have done more to kind of fundamentally
Of course.
alter the way
Yeah.
that we address these crises.
And it was very interesting that I just mentioned this last parting shot that the Seattle City Council lobbed her way 3 days before she left office. Council members Strauss and Peterson were looking for some legislation from the mayor on tree protection, had been waiting a few years for it, put out a press release last week saying, and COVID delays notwithstanding here, but Councilmember Strauss saying, "I'm deeply disappointed that Mayor Durkan has chosen to delay action to protect trees in Seattle once again." It's interesting to see that this very last communique from the Seattle City Council her way was a critique of some of the work that she's done. And there's a lot of different political machinations behind that. But just touching on this briefly, I think this is another part of the handoff from the Durkan legislation to the Harrell legislation, is talking about urban growth in all senses of the word there. Tree protection is certainly part of that. But how Mayor Harrell handles growth, I think, is an important part of our city's future too. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that is big. And, really, before the pandemic happened, this question
Mhm.
of growth was really, I mean, in some ways it goes hand in hand with homelessness. But this
Yes.
question,
Yeah.
Seattle
Mhm.
has been the fastest growing city for years.
Yeah.
Amazon, in particular, has driven a lot of that growth. And so I
Yep.
do think this question of growth and how we handle it has taken a back seat over the last few years, but has not gone away.
No way. Yeah.
Um, the city is gonna need to update its comprehensive plan in
Yep.
2024, which has big
Yep.
implications for zoning
Yep.
and where density is allowed. And so I think for Mayor Harrell, that is definitely going to be a big part of it, which is he's setting the course for how the Seattle absorbs that growth. I think
Yep.
under Mayor Durkan's mayorship, that sort of took a back seat. We didn't see the same.
Yeah.
You know, we had the big HOLA discussion under Ed Murray,
right.
which was this task force around making
housing
some
affordability,
zoning changes and housing affordability, and then that just really we didn't have any kind of equivalent of HOLA during Mayor Durkan's administration. There wasn't any sort of big, large, sweeping conversation around how we absorb growth. And I do think a lot of that is just because it got pushed to the back burner with all the crises.
Yep.
But it hasn't gone anywhere. And so Mayor Harrell is going to have to figure out, Seattle housing prices in Seattle are unsustainable. They are, they cannot continue as the way they are and not have sharper increases in homelessness. Young people unable to move back. And so, he's going to have to do something, and it'll be interesting to see what. I think the city council is going to push for more density and sort of zoning changes in a more aggressive way.
We're talking about getting rid of single-family zoning. Yep.
Whereas he has expressed more skepticism around that. So anyway, I don't know. We'll see. It'll be interesting.
Interesting indeed. And I have to say, underlying all of this, David, I just want to make sure we touched on this. COVID-19 cases rising so quickly here in our area. New cases across the country, new cases higher than they've ever been. In late December, a nearly 200% increase in cases in King County. I should point out that the early reports show Omicron does not appear to cause as many hospitalizations or deaths, but we are very early in our understanding of it. Just touching on this briefly with this, David, I saw an article recently about talking about adapting to coronavirus no longer feels like an emergency, but just a way of life. Some thoughts about that and where we are in the pandemic right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've read somewhere that there are kind of three possible scenarios, which is coronavirus becomes the best case scenario, and also what they said was the least likely is Omicron is the last variant and we all gain immunity and basically coronavirus goes away. That would be great.
Okay. Yeah.
Probably not going to happen.
Right.
The sort of second and maybe most likely is it becomes endemic, which is it basically becomes another seasonal flu with new variants that we are, we come up with a new shot every year.
Try to keep up with.
Shot. It doesn't kill nearly as many people as it's killing now, but it kills some people who are vulnerable in the way that the flu does. And it really does become kind of like a flu. The third scenario being it's like dengue fever, which is it disappears for a few years and then comes back with some fierce new variant that does cause legitimate death and suffering.
Right. Go ahead and plan for that. Okay.
So, who knows? I am at the point, this will probably change tomorrow. I'm at the point where Omicron, I think Omicron could actually turn out to be good news. I mean, every article we read, I was reading an article this morning that shows Omicron does not get down into the lungs nearly as much as other coronavirus variants. So it replicates really well in mouth and throat, but if it doesn't go down to the lungs, when it gets into the lungs, that's when people die and have really terrible side effects. So as of this morning, deaths are not up significantly in King County or even across the country. And so, maybe it becomes something that we just live with.
Boy, we'll have to see. That is going to be quite an interesting next few years to plan for, but I know we're going to be thinking about that in the months and years ahead. So, all right, here we go. A bit of a change to our show format here. We're going to talk about an alarming trend in traffic safety over the past year. Buckle up now for transportation talk. All right, well, David, you recently put together a story in the Seattle Times about an alarming trend when it comes to traffic deaths in our region. I wanted to talk about this. What'd you find out?
Well, I mean, this is not specific to our region. This is a national trend that we've
Sure.
seen, which is 2020 and now at the end of 2021 were
Yeah.
both really bad years for traffic safety. Seattle, Washington State, and Washington State will both have the deadliest year this year that they've had since 2006.
Wow.
So about 15 years. Same goes for serious crashes that result in serious injuries.
hmm
The interesting and kind of confounding part of it is total collisions are way down.
Hmm.
So what we're seeing is fewer collisions, but the collisions that do happen are much deadlier and more serious.
Yeah.
I think that this has been a real a discouraging and depressing thing for people who think a lot about traffic safety, because
Sure.
when the pandemic hit, there was some hope that the silver lining would be that fewer people would be
Would
dying
drive.
on the
Yeah. Yeah.
cars because there's just not as much driving. And
hmm
it was true that there were a lot fewer car crashes, but at the same time, because there were so many fewer cars on the roads, people were able to drive faster. So we've heard anecdotal reports about a lot more extreme speeding, people going 100 miles per
Interesting.
hour.
Yeah.
Also, impairment driving is up.
Sure. Yeah.
Alcohol and drug use while driving is up.
hmm
Um, and then, there's this kind of like vague nebulous sense that when people writ large are stressed out and
Yeah.
angry,
Because of
they take
COVID,
that out on the
etc.
road.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And so I think, when the pandemic happened in 2020, people hoped that that would mean fewer deaths. They were wrong in 2020.
Yeah.
So then as traffic started returning in 2021, there was some hope,
hmm
well, maybe deaths will start going down. Turns out
Right.
they haven't. They have stayed high. So it's and it hasn't broken through quite as much, I think, because of how much death and destruction COVID has wrought.
Of
But
course. Yeah.
it is across the whole country. This trend is really quite alarming to people, that we're seeing
Yeah.
pretty significant jumps in people dying on the roads.
And just to bring it back to a Seattle focus, I know you've also written recently about we're going to have a new Seattle Department of Transportation director. Bruce Harrell wants somebody else in there other than Sam Zimbabwe. Let's talk about maybe what you're discussing here with regard to traffic deaths. I know Seattle still has this Vision Zero in terms of reducing these traffic deaths to zero. Talk about what's next in the future for Seattle when it comes to transportation, when it comes to these safety issues, because I know Mayor Harrell is really looking closely at this. A new SDOT director wants to announce that person soon. I wonder what they're going to be inheriting there, this new SDOT director.
Yeah, they're going to be inheriting. I mean, they will have to. The city's going to have some money from the federal government from the large
Right.
infrastructure
ARPA.
package.
Mhm.
Don't know exactly how much or to what that
Okay.
will go to, but they will be inheriting a Vision Zero plan that isn't going in the right direction, and that's challenging. And the question will be sort of how philosophically, how do you view that problem?
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, some people view this as an enforcement problem, that they need to put more police on the streets,
Yeah.
catch more speeders, that sort of thing.
Sure.
But I think increasingly common is viewing this more as a design problem,
Yeah.
which is how do you, acknowledging that people make mistakes and do stupid things in their car, how do you
Sure.
create a system that when people screw up and make those mistakes do not end in something that's deadly?
Right.
So the big focuses are going to be on Aurora Avenue, which is consistently one of the city's deadliest streets.
hmm
I think Lake City Way.
Yeah.
These arterial streets these arterial streets that are wide have a lot of lanes. There are
Get their speed up.
pedestrians
Yeah. hmm
and traffic lights that people tend to run or miss
Yeah.
totally.
hmm
So how do you redesign these streets in a way that forces people to slow down, forces
Yeah.
people to pay more attention, and makes it so that not as many people are killed? I think those are going to be big. That's going to be a big job for the next SDOT director.
Huge issues there. Well, thank you for that, David. All right. Well, it's time to start wrapping up the show here. And in times past, folks, we've talked about baked goods to have during our coffee break podcast, but it's out with the old, in with the new. David, I wanted to talk to you about something. During a recent cyber stalking expedition that I took up here, I noticed on one of your social media accounts, you were an assistant to a head winemaker in New Zealand a couple years ago.
Yeah.
What's going on with that? Why are you not a famous vintner now? What's going on?
Yeah. So my now wife and I, we weren't married at the time, but used to, before I was a journalist, we used to do wine harvests. So we were
Awesome.
in Walla Walla in New Zealand, and it's a these, during the wine harvest, there's like a 3-month period when all the grapes become ripe and they have
Sure.
to be turned into wine. They can't sit around, and so in that period they need a lot of extra help. And so
Hmm.
you can hire young grunts like me and my wife.
Yeah.
And so you work for 80 hours a week for 3 months, and then your job is done. You get laid off basically. And so
Wow.
we did that. We worked in Walla Walla for 3 months,
Mhm.
then traveled for a while, and then you go to the southern hemisphere where, of course, it's fall again and
Yes.
it's harvest
Right.
season
Right.
again. So it was never going to be a career path, but it was
I see.
a fun way to earn a good chunk of money in a short period of time, and then use that money to go travel.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. So you decided winemaking might be a little too tough. Let's jump into something a lot easier, like journalism. That sounds like
Yeah,
a
right.
great idea.
Well, physically, it's far less
This is
exhausting.
true. This is true. This is true. Yeah. But
Yeah, winemaking is not a very. It's kind of a. My favorite saying about winemaking is it takes a lot of beer to make good wine, because by the end of making being in a winery, the last thing you want is more wine. It's kind of
right. Right. Right.
smell of rotting grapes all day and
Right. Right.
chemicals and things
I
like that.
love it.
But
I've also
it's
heard
not a
if you
very
want to make
glamorous job.
no, and if you want to make a small fortune in winemaking, start off with a large fortune. So that's
Yeah,
another way to
exactly.
look at it too.
Right,
Well,
exactly.
David is a very multi-talented fellow, folks, and he's a baseball fan too. So if we start talking about Sauvignon Blanc or how the Mariners want to fill a huge gap with the loss of Kyle Seager, do not be surprised. David, thank you so much for joining in with me for the show here.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's good to be here.
All right, cool. Well, thanks also to our patrons. Thanks to everybody listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you might listen. Again, please do support our show on Patreon. Always appreciated. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media too. We will see you soon. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.